Hello and welcome to Autology, the weekly podcast that brings you the latest on automotive technology. I'm Rebecca Bellchambers, and this week's episode is called Keeping Up with Tesla, a story of EE architecture. Here with me today is my guest Richard Dixon, Senior Principal Analyst at S&P Global Mobility, working within the EE and Semiconductor Group. Hi Richard, thank you for joining me on today's episode.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Rebecca. Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you.
No problem. Okay, so to kick us off, we hear a lot about a change that's coming to vehicle electronic and electrical architecture, or EE architecture as it's known. Can you explain to us what's happening and what are driving these reasons?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Thanks for the question. Yeah, so basically, what we see is really a transition in vehicle electronic and electrical architecture, or E architecture, if you like, from what we have today. Let me kind of explain it from the top. Typically, vehicles have ECUs, electronic control units, attached to them. So each time you add a function to a vehicle, you add an electronic control unit to control that function. And that's been the sort of model for the last decades where we've added more and more functionality to vehicles, and each time we've added ECUs. So what you have is like a distributed network, if you like, in the car of ECUs connected by buses, typically CAN and LIN type of buses, to move that data around between these ECUs so they can communicate. What we're seeing is the number of ECUs is really exploding because of advances in, firstly, electrification of the vehicle is adding new modules all the time to control the electric motor and to coordinate that with the engine, for example, and to manage the high voltage battery and the other battery in the car, the 12-volt battery. But also, we have a lot more sensors in the car as well. So in and around the car, especially starting with camera and radar and camera type of sensors, and eventually we will have even what are called lidar sensors here, and they're basically they're bringing in a lot of data into the vehicle. So the vehicle needs to collect and process large amounts of what is basically safety critical information from these systems, and you need new control units and new more powerful control units to control that. And then thirdly, I think is also the cars becoming increasingly connected to the cloud as well, connected to the outside world. So those that combination is seeing an explosion of data into the car, a need for control, a need for communication amongst the different ECUs. And so the first trend we're seeing is kind of adoption of new ECUs, more powerful ECUs, which are called domain controllers. And each of these controllers have got a lot more processing power in them and a lot more memory, and they manage a sort of set of control units for a particular domain. And by domain we mean, for example, in the safety domain, which would mean things like for the airbag system or for the steering or the brakes, or for the body domain. The body domain is typically the vehicle electrics, the lighting system, the access system, and so on. And then your driver assist and your powertrain and your cockpit, your infotainment system. So they're typically around five. And these domain controllers, so we are seeing of domain controllers to manage this increase in number of ECUs. So that's really the step that we see now happening in vehicles up to, and take us up to about 2025, at which time we'll start to see another development in the vehicle which is happening, which is called zonal architecture. So as you add all these domain controllers to the vehicle, you can start to introduce zone controllers and eliminate some of the ECUs. And these zone controllers are basically placed in a zone or location in the vehicle. And what they do is they take care of a set of ECUs, but they no longer really care about which domain those ECUs belong to. So they're no more about that logical connection between the ECUs. It's more about a physical connection, and they manage that in a sort of area of the vehicle here. So that's actually the kind of overall change, and really why this is called keeping up with Tesla is because Tesla's probably it's definitely the most advanced vehicle so far in terms of EE architecture, with their Model 3, which was introduced in 2017. And that vehicle is really kind of a very widely studied vehicle, largely for a number of reasons, which I'll go into a little bit later. But basically, it's got a high amount of action of hardware into software. So what they've done is they've pulled a lot of the functionality which is in these little boxes, these ECUs, and they've pulled the code from that into three larger boxes there, and then they've eliminated a lot of the ECUs in that case. So the functionality is managed mostly on the software level. And then what you've done is by removing a lot of ECUs, you remove a lot of wiring. And that's a very important development. That's one of the reasons why the vehicles are so widely studied, is because you have less wiring. So the wiring harness is really a part of the vehicle, which is extremely heavy. It's the third heaviest component in the car. And obviously, car makers are looking to save weight, especially with the electrification of the vehicle. So every gram of weight that you save is equal to more range in in a battery electric vehicle. And one of the ways to do that is to kind of rationalize the hardware and the connections between the hardware, so the wiring, simplify that hardware, and then basically have a lot of savings in weight. But also it saves in manufacturability as well. And it means that it's also manifested in the fact that Tesla's vehicles can be manufactured as quickly as 10 hours. So they say that they can make their vehicles in 10 hours, and that's much quicker than the competition. That's probably two times faster than the competition. And it's a kind of a combination of the way the vehicle is put together, obviously the way the hardware is managed and the new wiring system in there, but it's also an increased use of robotics as well. So obviously when we look at the car makers and we see how they've responded to this and whether they're deciding to adopt a similar kind of architecture, we see that currently Tesla's about five years ahead of the competition. So obviously, as the different OEMs look at adopting similar approaches, they're obviously looking to Tesla to see how that's done.
Hmm. Okay, so just following on from that point with Tesla, why is it that some OEMs or car makers are apparently quicker to adopt this new EE architecture than
Mm.
others? And can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the roadmaps from the
Sure.
OEMs?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question. Yeah, so basically, this obviously will happen. This transition, which I described in the beginning, which is will be adopted by a lot of the industry, by no means all the industry, but by a lot of the car makers in the industry, will move at different rates, as I mentioned here, and that really depends a lot on many factors. One being the OEM strategy, the type of portfolio they have, the type of vehicles they have in their portfolio. It also depends a lot on the in-house competencies they have, the strength of their teams, their engineering teams, for example. Especially as I mentioned with Tesla, a lot of this story is happening on the software level. So it's like we're calling this a centralization of the architecture, if you like. It's moving away from a disparate amount of ECUs with lots of code and centralizing this code and bringing it into one place where it can be more frequently updated and more efficiently updated. So you have one big packet of software which manages all the functions in the vehicle there, and that's your work is no longer so much on the platform architecture of the vehicle and the hardware of the vehicle, it's on the software side. So you can do that much more frequently, and obviously you can do that after the vehicle's in the market because you can do that over the air, for example. So you can add many improvements to the vehicle once it's even in the market. So the strengths that you need for that is definitely a big focus on software. So good software engineers, lots of software engineers, and software engineers who are capable of managing this transition from these like individual units with small bits of code into a much larger software pack, which kind of manages all those functions across all the different domains in the vehicle there, which is across the middleware, and that's actually called. It also depends a lot on the legacy architecture. So when you look at who's adopted these novel new architectures first, obviously Tesla. So Tesla is really a newcomer to the market. They have a very focused portfolio of vehicles, which are basically battery electric vehicles here, performance vehicles with a particular market segment in mind, and they only have two or three, yeah, three or four vehicles in their portfolio. So they have a very narrow focused portfolio, which meant they could develop cars efficiently for a particular market with a certain price point. And so that's what they've done. If you're, on the other hand, a large established OEM with a wide portfolio of vehicles, which have lots of different powertrain types, you might have vehicles which are in in a market like Malaysia or Thailand, which are are not very equipment heavy, not very technology heavy. And on the other hand, you might be targeting other mature markets where you might want to use things like advanced driving assist systems and electrified powertrains. So you have a different issue there. You have to look at how you can you have to look carefully at the costs of these new systems and how you can bring that across the portfolio, if you like. So that's why we see Tesla with a focused portfolio, a lack of, like, if you like, a lack of legacy architecture, vehicle architecture, able to come in, look at the problem from outside and look and see how would you want to do this? Which other industries could we look at to see how they would manage such a data network? And that's how that's kind of evolved there. And we see other followers from the sort of fast followers, if you like, for Tesla. First from Chinese brands like Xiaopeng, BYD, and Dongfeng. Already in 2022, we saw these types of vehicles coming to the market, similar kinds of vehicles to Tesla. So really high-end battery electric vehicles, you would call these. And they have a similar kind of moving very quickly to zonal architectures. In other words, very efficient designs which allow reduced number of electronic control units, reduced amount of wiring, for example, here. So very efficient systems, datable over the air, so be able to take account of new business models, which would allow you to provide services after the vehicle's in the market, for example. And then I think, if you think about, okay, well, that's and 23 is the same. You add a number of major Chinese OEMs like Great Wall and Chang'an and NFAW and so on. There's a few more. What's typically happening is it's the Chinese players are typically making if they have a wider portfolio, they have sub brands, so they kind of establish a sub brand for that vehicle. I think an example would be Geely. Geely is actually a very large Chinese manufacturer with a wide portfolio, but their high end EV where they're kind of focusing their tech approach, like, is with Zeekr. And Zeekr in 2025 will be like the first vehicle after Tesla that we think which will have basically this very highly centralized computer design, if you like. If you think about which North American and European OEMs or car makers will be coming to the market, certainly around 2024, we already see Stellantis. So some of the sub brands of Stellantis, I mean, that's a big brand with 14 different brands. So it's interesting to see how Stellantis will roll out its new zonal and center brain type of architecture approach. But we see definitely with Jeep in North America and with Peugeot here in Europe, we believe those will be the first examples within that group. And then followed 25 by BMW, Volvo, for example, 26 by Renault and GM, and so on. So then you start to see some of the other established brands really coming to market with these more advanced architectures. And I think what we could say, if I was to say anything, by 2034, our current study goes out to 2034. We believe that about 38% of vehicles will have one of these zonal designs. In other words, an efficient design for managing the in-vehicle network. And that's up from about 2% in 2022 in terms of vehicle volume.
Okay, so you talk about 2025 a lot. What comes after 2025? What are we looking at here?
Yeah, well, I think up to 2025 is really between 2017 when we saw the first major domain controllers adopted, and then up to 2025, this is domain controller focused in the majority of the market. And after 2025, we'll see much more of a pickup of these zonal architectures, as I've mentioned here. And then a kind of that's when we start to see the increased centralization of the architecture as well. And by what I mean by that is these domain controllers that we've talked about, and you can imagine things like the typical ones we would see are a domain controller for the cockpit, which is called a cockpit domain controller, for the to manage the increased number of displays inside the car, for example, and the increased resolution of those displays. You can bring in cockpit domain controllers to reduce the number of ECUs. We also see the driver or the autonomy domain controller coming in, and then kind of manage everything else. It can be a body domain controller, or what we believe we will see is vehicle domain controllers. So from that domain control model, where we will see a kind of increased amount of integration. It's like an integration roadmap, if you like, of that hardware, and then we'll start to see typically the driving or the ADC, the autonomy domain controller, come in with the infotainment domain controller into one box, and then even potentially with the vehicle domain controller in the same box as well. And that would be like what we would call a center computer inside there. So everything's centralized inside that hardware. It could be that there are powerful SoCs or system on chip based processors which will manage all this, or will do the processing for all this integration here. Either several, or it can even be one very powerful SoC, if you like. But we probably see as well combinations of different SoCs for different domains still. But that roadmap is kind of an obvious way to just bring together the boxes, reduce the hardware. That way you eliminate things like PCBs and connections and connectors and so on. It's just becoming cheaper that way. But for us, as soon as you have this higher level of integration post 25, that's is really, I think, the dawn of what we would call the uptake of much more central computer based architecture.
Hmm. Okay, so are we seeing any OEMs that are struggling with this sort of shift? And we're talking about new hardware here. What are the implications for the suppliers as well as the OEMs?
This is not so easy to do this on one hand for some several reasons. I mean, basically, by bringing these different domains of the vehicle together, that's typically usually different departments within a company. So it kind of implies also that you need a restructure internally of the company as well. So that's one thing that car makers will have to contend with. The second is, I think, the software aspect is really not at all to be underestimated. It's very difficult, and I think that, an example is for Volkswagen. So Volkswagen has the very, how would I say it? They had a very good vision for the hardware and the software part of their architecture for their battery electric vehicle portfolio. So I mean, they announced that they want to have a very high proportion of battery electric vehicles across their portfolio, including Audi and Porsche, Volkswagen. And the way they wanted to do this most efficiently was to simplify the hardware. So have some hardware blocks, some domain controllers, some zone controllers, but few variations of these depending on what the need is. But then have just one basic software system, or one software system which can be suited to all the different variations there and can be more frequently updated. And they've had some difficulty putting that together, I think, because actually, probably, to be fair, the sheer complexity of all the requirements of such a wide portfolio has meant that their software roadmap has been somewhat delayed by several years. So that was planned for like a central skateboard platform, SSP, on which all the electric vehicles could be built with some hardware blocks, and then one single piece of software called E3 2.0. And that's the part which has probably been delayed by a couple of years. And I think, on the other side, we see, for example, just very recently, Ford talked about some, the CEO of Ford talked about some difficulties in their first major EVs, like their Mach E, which is what they're hoping to also sell, in the market against Tesla, for example. And he commented that they had not really been radical enough in the design, and they certainly had not managed to make the same kind of savings in wiring, for example. That's where the Model 3 really made a big impact compared to its previous Model S, which had 50% less wiring in the end. And on the hardware side, another example would be Volvo. So on their road to a zonal design, that roadmap didn't roll out at the kind of same rate that they expected. They will reach a zonal design in 2025, we believe, by which time they will be able to reduce the number of ECUs on their electric vehicles, because currently on their high end vehicles they're well in excess of 100 ECUs. So it's kind of, Volvo's goal is to bring down the wiring, to bring down the number of ECUs, and they see zonal architecture as the way to do that.
Okay, so Obviously, I appreciate this is probably the million-dollar question right now, but can you give us an idea of what is the size of the market that is generated by this new hardware for EE
Sure.
architecture?
Sure, yeah, that's a million-dollar question. Yeah, well, I think that we're still working on the exact size of the dollar size of the market. If you like, we have very good data on the volume of the platforms. But basically, it's if you wanted to pick a number, it's somewhere in between 35 to 40 billion US dollars for the new hardware. So for that, I'm talking about these more powerful ECUs, these domain controllers, even these central computers, the zone control units, for example. If you add that all together, you're talking about probably a market of around that by 2034, about 40 billion. That's all upside. There is a certain amount of downside to that, of course, because those units tend to replace and eliminate a number of other ECUs. That's the whole point of doing this. So there are some losses there and some consolidation on the other side. And we're still assessing that side, but certainly we're still left with a positive game because these are ultimately things like domain controllers and controllers and center computers are ultimately brand new devices, if you like.
Well, it certainly sounds like a promising market for sure. Okay, great. So thank you. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for today. So I'd like to say a big thank you to you, Richard, for joining Autology and sharing your insights with us.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And a big thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's episode at our autology@spglobal.com email. And you can find out much more at autotechinsight.ihsmarket.com. Don't forget to hit all of the subscribe, follow, and like buttons to stay on track with the latest Autology podcasts. And we look forward to you joining us again in the next episode. Bye for now and have a great day.